I've lived in many worlds, each alive in its own way. I grew up in the US and Germany, where life was fast-paced and structured. Backpacking through Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia, life was colorful and vibrant. My time in Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia, life was bold and adventurous. And my home in Uganda and time in Rwanda was eye-opening and humbling. Our world is alive, it's awake, and there is noise everywhere. From our cities to our phones and even our thoughts, we're constantly moving, walking, watching, listening, and probably doing all those things at the same time. But underneath all that noise, there's something else. Silence. In some places, silence is survival. In others, it's indifference. But everywhere, it tells us a story about power. In East Africa, people learn to stay quiet about abuse and corruption, not out of apathy, but protection. In Southeast Asia, it wasn't gunfire that filled the air, but the quiet whispers about what had happened and what could happen again. And in South America, the traces of conflict were evident in the way that people moved, spoke, and trusted one another. Meanwhile, in the US and Germany, silence took a different form. It wasn't out of danger, but discomfort. A silence we avoid by staying silent and by staying busy. While I was abroad, I had worked for local NGOs, and I taught English on the side to sustain myself. And it was during this time where I had observed how silence allowed for violence to take root. See, violence comes in different forms. Sometimes it's direct, which is visible and brutal, and sometimes it's structural, built into the inequalities and injustices of our day-to-day lives. And at first, I blamed the system around me, the corrupt officials, the absent governments, and the exploitative businesses. But over time, I had realized that I wasn't observing anymore. I was part of the system. All of a sudden, I caught myself normalizing things that I was doing, things like paying off an officer, even though I had done nothing wrong. That's extortion. Or wearing a wedding ring, even though I wasn't married, to avoid certain people on the streets, to avoid men, to signal to them that someone was waiting for me at home. Now that's deception. Am I part of the problem now? These contradictions between what I had believed and what I was actually doing forced me to confront my own convictions, and is the reason why I'm standing here today. Now I'm a doctoral researcher at the Friedrich Alexander University, trying to understand what happens when ethics meets reality, when businesses operate in places where peace and justice can't be taken for granted. Because even amid violence, business is everywhere. And since then, my work has taken me to Mexico, where I've spoken to many managers navigating violence and corruption, all in their own way trying to do business amid chaos. Silence. For some, it's uncomfortable. And for others, it's become an instrument. And these aren't abstract thoughts. They're the reality of doing business in conflict. When we hear the word war, we often think of soldiers, tanks, and front lines. That's conventional warfare. Armies against armies, battles fought over territory. But war has other faces too. There's psychological warfare, for example, using fear, propaganda, and disinformation to weaken morale, to control narratives, and to create division. Or cyber warfare, hacking, sabotaging critical infrastructure to target governments, businesses, and individuals. And as you can see from these few examples, battlefields come in different forms. When conflict erupts, our instinct is usually the same. We look to governments. It's their job to protect us. It's their duty to make peace, which, in an ideal world, that might be great. But we don't live in such a world. So instead of asking, what are they doing? What if we asked, what are we? What am I doing? In ethics, we have a concept called moral intensity, which is how strong we feel the need to act. One key element is proximity. And proximity has 4 different types. There's physical, the one that we usually associate with proximity, but there's also social, cultural, and psychological. Let's look at the first 2 in order to make this point. Physical proximity. Many in Europe, many in my generation, have always felt that war was far away. It's somewhere over there. Well, that no longer is the case. Physical proximity to conflict has come much closer to this part of the world. And so, our moral intensity increased. Social proximity. We are tied to conflict through our global systems, whether that's through supply chains, shipment routes, or market links, a factory sourcing material from this repressive regime, and shipments delayed because of violent fighting somewhere else. And so that war over there becomes our war over here, and suddenly there's a shift in our morale. We feel the need, the urge, to react. And despite all these ties that we have to conflict, the story about business hasn't changed. Their only job is to maximize profit. They belong to shareholders and no one else, and the business of business is to do business. Well, I'm here today to challenge that. I think there's an illusion of neutrality, an illusion that corporations are only market actors. In the field of business and human rights, we use something that's called complicity, which is how strong businesses are drawn into harm without direct intent. Sometimes that's by benefiting, and sometimes that's by staying silent. Silence in the face of violence is not neutrality. That is a choice. Which brings me to the next question I hear quite often, but Milena, who really is responsible here? My lawyer friends would say, this is simple. Businesses have to follow international law and abide to legal frameworks. And I understand that. But here's the thing. If I would propose this to actors in conflict regions, they would not take me serious, because when the rule of law and institutions are weak, the question is not about legality. The question becomes an ethical one. So again, let me ask, who really is responsible here? A helpful lens comes from someone who lived through Nazi Germany, Hannah Arendt. She wrote about the relationship between judgment, thought, and moral responsibility in times of crisis. She said that responsibility is not about blame. It's about the ability to respond, the ability to act. The question isn't who is guilty, the question is who can do something about it. And in conflict regions, businesses are often right at the front lines. We tend to categorize businesses in one of 3 roles. First, business as the cause to violence through corruption, exploitation, unfair practices. They're the bad guys. Sometimes we categorize them as business as the victim, threatened, targeted, extorted. And sometimes we even classify them as businesses as solutions, providing jobs, community engagement, strengthening institutions. On paper, this looks very neat, and it makes it easy for us to talk about. But in reality, these lines are very much blurred. And that's also the point. Businesses aren't neutral. They're part victim, part solution, and part cause. And sometimes they fall under all three categories at once. Let me give you a real-life example. A corporation operates in a conflict region. To protect its workers, it has to make payments to rebel groups for their protection. Victim or cause to violence? Let me give you another example. A global manufacturing corporation operates in a war zone. In order for it to move its trucks across checkpoints, it has to make payments to terrorist groups. Why? Because these terrorist groups are the ones that control the checkpoints. Operational necessity or moral failure? Well, often it's both. And that's the point. Businesses aren't neutral. So the question isn't that pointing a finger is the right way. It's about recognizing your agency, the power to act. But it isn't just about what we do. It's also about how we think or fail to think. So let's ask, what kind of actors do we want? Hannah Arendt warned of a danger, not ignorance, but something more subtle. She called it thoughtlessness, the refusal to reflect on the consequences of one's own actions. She saw how ordinary people maintaining systems, following orders, doing their jobs, could become part of extraordinary harm, and not because they're all monsters. And this isn't confined to individuals, but amplified if we follow the herd, as Martin Luther King, the US civil rights leader, had preached. He warned of blind conformity, against simply going along just because it's comfortable. Martin Luther King reminded us that justice requires the courage to resist groupthink. Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil. Martin Luther King called it moral cowardice. Both point to the same direction. Harm spreads when people stop thinking for themselves, when they only obey, conform, and stay silent. And this is the kind of danger for business too. The kind of morality that says, I'm just maximizing shareholder value over here. Or, but this is protocol, ma'am. When harm spreads not out of hatred, but out of people who stop questioning and who stop reflecting. So let me ask again, is this the kind of actor we want? Or can we imagine something else? What if corporations weren't just market-neutral players, but civic institutions? What if we taught managers to reclaim moral imagination, to not just ask what is profitable, but also what is right? And so when managers ask me, what can we do? I wish there were a simple answer, but there really isn't one. Every business has its own pressures, every conflict looks different in itself, and every decision made carries its own risk. And that is precisely why responsibility isn't a cost-benefit analysis. It's an ethical decision-making process, one that requires reflection and a moral foundation for any strategy. Silence. Fear often drives silence. Fatigue often excuses it. Sometimes it's chosen, and sometimes it's imposed, but both are dangerous. Corporations must recognize their power, influence, and the voice they have within, but also outside of their environment. So too must we, as individuals, remember that corporations are places where people come together to create, to innovate, to shelter. There's purpose there, and it matters. It's easy to say from the outside, follow these rules and comply to this framework, but it's not always that simple. Some things can't be understood with the mind if they haven't yet been lived with the heart. And so when I was abroad, I was angry. How could these powerful institutions turn their back towards these people? I blamed them. I blamed everyone except myself, until I realized that I was accepting this culture of silence. I was silent. But I learned that silence is not always the absence of noise. Sometimes it's also the absence of reflection. We must be careful that what we are, productive, efficient, successful, doesn't become more important than who we are. Because when we lose that balance, we mistake noise with meaning and progress with peace. Corporations, as well as individuals, must realize that they're not only economic actors, but also moral actors within our shared world. We started in silence, the space where thought can truly begin. But thought alone isn't enough. Let that thought move through your heart and shape you in order for it to reach this world with compassion, with kindness, and with courage. Because that is where our humanity and possibly our peace may begin. Thank you.